Ross Greenwood, thank you for joining me. How good are these figures today?
Quite phenomenal, Andrew. I mean, I don't think people should underestimate the way in which not only the government but the Australian people have responded and rebounded from the recession that we had last year, caused by the coronavirus, of course. But it is, the amount of stimulus that the government has put in, and when you consider it's 10% of GDP, so you're talking the best part of $400 billion in extra debt that they've taken on, plus interest rates at zero. As I saw one economist say today, if the economy did not respond to that, then the government would have been seriously worried. So just to put it into perspective, in the last recession that we had, the 1990s, it took almost 2 years before the economy had got back to the same size it was before it entered the recession. In this case, it's just 12 months. And so you sit here and you cannot really sort of underestimate the importance of what the government did, but then also the resilience of Australians and the confidence of Australians to go and spend and recognise that their jobs were going to be okay.
I don't doubt for a second these are great numbers, but is it going to go on? It's just like, we've had the sugar hit, we've responded, but now it's going to be hard yards.
Yeah, that's true. And at some point, there is a day of reckoning for all of this. There is no doubt about that. Governments can't continue to borrow and spend forever. Central banks can't keep interest rates at zero forever. And already there are signs of the inflationary pressures that will come. If you're trying to build a house right now, it is now more expensive to do so because of a shortage of timber, of even things like brass for taps, of piping for the plumbing. So these things add to the costs, and those costs simply are put on either the price of the house or indeed eventually filter into inflation. There's shortage of labour around the place, and that means increases in wages. So these inflationary pressures are just not here. They're in the United States. They will eventually come into Europe. And the question is what then central banks will do. Do they start changing their message and talking about the prospect for higher interest rates? What does that do to equity markets? What does that do to property markets? Because that's the question for the future. But I've got to say, it's not the question for now. For the next 12 months at least, the Reserve Bank here in Australia, central banks around the world and the government here are not going to take any chances of falling back into a recession, certainly not in this term of Parliament.
But I do worry about inflation because, as I said, that when the budget came down, that they were perhaps dreaming to think that inflation would stay at these record lows for a couple of years, which has implications, of course. Then our massive debt pushing up to $1 trillion is not going to, compound with all these massive interest rates at all. We'd handle all that. But if it does, in fact, look like taking off much earlier than expected, what sort of problems will that cause us?
Well, number one, it depends on what the Reserve Bank does and what the early indication from the Reserve Bank is that they're going to look through any sort of short-term inflation. And the reason for that is that they will say, well, look, once international borders are open, then you can get more international students in. You can then bring in travellers, tourists, all that type of stuff. So that will actually start to rebalance the costs, particularly of labour, across the economy. So that's the reason why they'll say initially that they'll look through it. The bigger problem, and the one that I think you're addressing, is here the long-term systemic inflation. And one of the issues from past recessions is once inflation gets into an economy, it takes a long time to get it out. Another economist I spoke to today said in some cases, the worst cases, you actually need another recession to get that inflation out of your economy. So that is almost, if you like, the worst case scenario that the government would have to manage, the Reserve Bank would have to manage. And of course, the Reserve Bank right now would be very wary about trying to raise interest rates or giving any signals of increasing interest rates anytime soon. So off the back of these better than expected economic numbers today, you saw the stock market rise. You suddenly saw, say, for example, the lockdown in Victoria right now has caused the long-term government bonds to ease, suggesting there's more government money going to be put into Victoria to try and help workers out and help businesses there. So all of these things, if you like, just help that sort of narrative that maybe they're all hoping at least that this inflation is not going to come anytime soon.
Well, you mentioned bailing out Victoria. Do you think it should be bailed out? I can't believe that the Morrison government could afford not to bail out Victoria because it's got an election to fight, including in Victoria, in just a few months' time. Do you think it'll hang out, hang tough and say, look, you caused this lockdown, you're on your own, or will it cough up the cash?
No, if you think about it, it will be depending very much on where they think their seats and their politics lie there. And that is that they might try and string the Victorian government along effectively. But in the truth, there are a lot of people who might be disgruntled with the Victorian government right now for these lockdowns, and particularly in business, that the federal government will not wish to add to their anguish or to their angst. And so as a result, just as they had done with the Queensland tourism industry up north, that they effectively did help to bail them out, notwithstanding the fact that they didn't necessarily want to reward the Queensland state government. So the reality is that the federal government will step in, will help. Even tonight, it's understood that the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, is considering a plan. But just to put some context into this, I note that James Merlino today, acting Premier of Victoria, said another $209 million will be added to a package that is already some $250 million. So let's call it the best part of, what's that, $450 million in total. And yet the direct cost now of this lockdown is likely to be more than $2 billion. The indirect costs on top of that, another $3 billion. So effectively, they have stuck a Band-Aid worth about 10% over the cost of this lockdown that they have imposed on their people because systems were not right. And as Jennifer Westacott told me, the boss of the Business Council over the weekend, there is a systemic problem in Victoria that needs to be fixed, that hasn't been fixed, and lessons haven't been learned properly.
Absolutely correct. Ross Greenwood, thank you for your time.
Quite okay.